Hey everyone. This is a section from a chapter from Kenan Malik's book, The Meaning of Race. Race, History, and Culture in Western Society. The chapter is titled Universalism, Humanism, and the Discourse of Race. And the particular section I'm reading is titled Humanism, Colonialism, and the Holocaust. Associated with the anti-universalist stance of post-structuralist theories has been an unremitting hostility to a humanist approach. Humanism, we should recall, is a philosophy which takes human experiences as the starting point for humankind's knowledge of humankind's self and humankind's relation to nature. The anthropocentric outlook underpinned the scientific and philosophical revolution unleashed by the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. At the heart of humanism are two key beliefs. First, humanists hold that human beings, while an inherent part of nature and subject to nature's laws, nevertheless have an exceptional status in nature because of their unique ability arising out of human sociability to overcome the constraints placed upon them by nature. Second, humanists believe in the unity of humankind, holding that all humans possess something in common, something which is often described as a common, quote, human nature. The humanist outlook has expressed itself in a variety of political forms, from liberalism to Marxism. Liberal humanists tend to view human nature as a static, eternal quality given by nature. David Hume, for instance, argued that, quote, there is a great uniformity among the acts of men in all nations and ages, and that human nature remains the same in its principles and operations, end quote. Hume, Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Marx, on the other hand, saw the human essence as a social or historical construct. In his theses on Feuerbach, for example, Marx criticized the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach for, quote, abstracting from the historical process, unquote, and assuming that the human essence was, quote, an internal dumb generality which naturally unites the many individuals, unquote. But, argued Marx, quote, the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, the human essence is the ensemble of the social relations, end quote. Marx. In other words, quote, historical humanism, end quote, as Georg Lukács called it, sees, quote, man, not as a naturally given, but, quote, as a product of himself and of his own activity in history, end quote. Lukács. The historical novel. There doesn't seem to be a good description for this book. Anyway, end footnote. Whether liberal or Marxist, the underlying all humanistic strands is a belief in human emancipation, the idea that humankind can rationally transform society through the agency of its own efforts. Indeed, no emancipatory philosophy is possible without a humanist perspective, for any anti-humanistic outlook is forced to look outside humanity for the agency of salvation. Conversely, no humanist outlook is possible without an accompanying belief in human rationality and capacity for social progress. Anti-humanistic strands developed from the Enlightenment onwards, largely in opposition to the idea of rational human emancipation. Just as there have been a number of different strains of humanism, so there have been a number of different strains of anti-humanism, ranging from the conservatism of Burke, the Catholic reaction of de Maistre, to the nihilism of Nietzsche and the Nazism of Martin Heidegger. All rejected Enlightenment rationalism and the idea of social progress, because they despaired of the capacity of humankind for such rational progress. As we have seen in earlier chapters, such despair was in general an expression of either fear or of contempt for the masses, who were seen as irrational, atavistic, and a threat to civilized society. Anti-humanism rejected ideas of equality and human unity, celebrating instead difference and divergence, and exalting the particular and the authentic over the universal. Anti-humanism developed, therefore, as a central component of elite theories and hence of racial theories. In the post-war era, however, anti-humanism came to represent a very different tradition, the liberal, indeed radical, anti-colonialist and anti-racist outlook, in the hands of such critics of Western society as Frantz Fanon, Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Louis Althusser, among others. Anti-humanism became a central thread of structuralist and post-structuralist theories, and a key weapon in the interrogation of racist and imperialist discourses. Quote, "Humanism," Sartre wrote in his famous preface to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, quote, "is nothing but an ideology of lies, a perfect justification for pillage. Humanism's honeyed words, humanism's affectations of sensibility were only alibis for our aggression." End quote. Sartre. How did a philosophical outlook which originated within conservative anti-emancipatory politics, which was a key component of racial theory, become a central motif of radical anti-racist, anti-imperialist doctrines? How did philosophers such as Nietzsche and Heidegger, whose work had previously been seen as paving the way for 20th century racist and fascist ideologies, become icons of anti-racist discourse? Understanding this puzzle will take us a long way towards explaining the relationship between theories of race and the contemporary discourse of difference. There were two main strands to post-war radical anti-humanism. One developed out of anti-colonial struggles, the other through Western and in particular French academic philosophy, and was subsequently elaborated by the quote, new social movements, end quote, such as feminism and environmentalism, which emerged in the late 60s and 70s. In The Wretched of the Earth, the Martinique-born Algerian nationalist Frantz Fanon gave voice to the rage of colonial peoples against their inhuman treatment at the hands of the imperialist powers. The humanist idea of, quote, man, wrote Fanon, which lay at the heart of the Western post-Enlightenment tradition, was achieved through the dehumanizing of the non-Western other. Quote, the same Europe where they were never done talking of man, and where they never stopped proclaiming that they were only anxious for the welfare of man, today we know what sufferings humanity has paid for every one of their triumphs of the mind, end quote. Fanon. Wretched of the Earth. Europeans only became human, suggested Fanon, by denying humanity to their colonial other. As Sartre put it, quote, humanism is the counterpart of racism. Humanism is a practice of exclusion, end quote. Sartre. Critique of Dialectical Reason, Volume 1, Theory of Practical Ensembles. End footnote. According to Sartre, quote, there is nothing more consistent than a racist humanism, since the European has only been able to become a man through creating slaves and monsters, end quote. Sartre. To maintain a belief in humanism while treating non-European peoples as animals, Europeans declared that non-Europeans were in fact subhuman. Herein lies the source of racial theory in humanism. At the same time, argued Fanon, humanists solved their salved their conscience by inviting the subhuman colonial other to become human by imitating, quote, European man, end quote. Quote, Western bourgeois racial prejudice as regards the nigger and the Arab is a racism of contempt. Western bourgeois racial prejudice is a racism which maintains what Western bourgeois racial prejudice hates. Bourgeois ideology, however, which is the proclamation of an essential equality between men, manages to appear logical in its own eyes by inviting the subhuman to become human, to take as their prototype Western humanity as incarcerated in the Western bourgeoisie. End quote. Kenan, The Wretched of the Earth. The category, quote, human, end quote, was empty of meaning, such critics asserted, because the category human was ahistoric. The invocation of a common human nature hid the fact that human nature is socially and historically constructed. According to James Clifford, quote, it is a general feature of humanist common denominators that they are meaningless, since they bypass local cultural codes that make personal experience articulate, end quote. James Clifford. The Predicament of Culture, 20th Century Ethnography, Literature, Art. Wikipedia says James Clifford, born 1945, is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work combines perspectives from history, literature, history of science, and anthropology. And his book, let's look up his book. The Predicament of Culture, 20th Century Ethnography, Literature, and Art by James Clifford. It's published by Harvard University Press. And its description says, the predicament of culture is a critical ethnography of the West, in the West's changing relations with other societies, analyzing cultural practices such as anthropology, travel writing, collecting, and museum displays of tribal art. James Clifford shows authoritative accounts of other ways of life to be contingent fictions, now actively contested in post-colonial contexts. James Clifford's critique raises questions of global significance. Who has the authority to speak for any group's identity and authenticity? What are the essential elements and boundaries of a culture? How do self and, quote, the other, end quote, clash in the encounters of ethnography, travel, and modern inter-ethnic relations? In chapters devoted to the history of anthropology, Clifford discusses the work of Malinowski, Mead, Griol, Levi-Strauss, Turner, Gertz, and other influential scholars. James Clifford also explores the affinity of ethnography with avant-garde art and writing, recovering a subversive, self-reflective cultural criticism. The surrealist encounters with Paris or New York, the work of Georges Bataille and Michel Leiris in the Collège de Sociologie, and the hybrid constructions of recent tribal artists offer provocative ethnographic examples that challenge familiar notions of difference and identity. In an emerging global modernity, the exotic is unexpectedly nearby, the familiar strangely distanced. Back to the text and footnote. When humanists assert the universality of human nature, what humanists are really talking about are the particular human values expressed in European society. Quote, those universal features which define the human, end quote, argues Robert Young, quote, mask over the assimilation of human itself with European values, end quote. Robert Young. The category of the human, Robert Young believes, quote, however exalted in the category of the human's conception, end quote, is, quote, too often invoked only in order to put the male before the female or to classify other, quote, races, end quote, as subhuman and therefore not subject to the ethical prescriptions applicable to humanity at large, end quote. Third world critics, however, did not reject humanism in humanism's entirety. Fanon, for instance, recognized that the contradiction lay not so much in humanism itself as in the disjuncture between the ideology of humanism and the practice of colonialism. Quote, all the elements of a solution to the great problems of humanity have at different times existed in European thought, but Europeans have not carried out in practice the mission which fell to Europeans, which consisted of bringing the Europeans' whole weight to bear violently upon these elements, of modifying their arrangements and their nature, of changing them, and finally of bringing the problem of mankind to an infinitely higher plane, end quote. Fanon. Fanon called, therefore, for a new humanism stripped of humanism's racist Eurocentric aspects. Quote, let us decide not to imitate Europe. Let us combine our muscles and our brains in a new direction. Let us try to create the whole man, whom Europe has been incapable of bringing to triumphant birth. End quote. Fanon. For Fanon, then, the humanist idea of the, quote, whole man, end quote, was key to emancipation. Despite the critique of Western humanism as a camouflage for the dehumanization of non-Western peoples, humanism remained a central component of the ideology of Third World liberation struggles of the post-war era, virtually all of which drew on the emancipatory logic of universalism. Indeed, Western radicals are often shocked by the extent to which anti-colonial struggles adopted with the radicals conceived as tainted ideas. The concepts of universalism and unilinear evolutionism, Levi-Strauss observed, found, quote, unexpected support from peoples who desire nothing more than to share in the benefits of industrialization. People prefer to look on themselves as temporarily backward rather than permanently different, end quote. Levi-Strauss. The View from Afar. Hold on. No, not View from Afar. Structural Anthropology, Volume 2. And elsewhere, Levi-Strauss noted ruefully that the doctrine of cultural relativism, quote, was challenged by the very people for whose moral benefit the anthropologists had established it in the first place, end quote. The willingness of Third World radicals to maintain at least a residual support for a humanistic outlook stemmed from their continued engagement in the project of liberation. Post-war radicals in the West, however, increasingly rejected humanism, not simply in its guise as a cover for racism and colonialism, but in humanism's entirety. For post-war European intellectuals, the most pressing problem was not that of establishing the ideological foundations of liberation struggles, but rather of coming to terms with the demise of such struggles in Western democracies. Western intellectuals had, on the one hand, to excavate the social and intellectual roots of the Nazi experience, an experience which more than any other weighed upon the European intellectual consciousness in the immediate post-war period, and on the other, to explain why the possibilities of revolutionary change, which had seemed so promising in the early part of the century, appeared to have extinguished. For many, the explanation lay in some deep-seated malaise in European culture. Post-war radicals asked themselves why it was that Germany, a nation with deep philosophical roots in the Enlightenment project, and a strong and vibrant working class movement should succumb so swiftly and so completely to Nazism? The answer seemed to be that it was the logic of Enlightenment rationalism itself and the nature of democratic politics that had given rise to such barbarism. As Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, members of the, quote, Frankfurt School of radical German scholars, put it in their seminal work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, quote, Enlightenment is totalitarian, end quote. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer developed the two motifs, a critique of Enlightenment rationality and social progress on the one hand, and of mass society on the other, which were to become immensely influential in shaping post-war discourse. The idea that the Holocaust, and indeed all Western barbarism, found its roots in Enlightenment rationalism and humanism became a central tenet of post-war radicalism. As Levi-Strauss expressed it in an interview in Le Monde, quote, all the tragedies we have lived through, first with colonialism, then with fascism, finally the concentration camps, all this has taken shape not in opposition to or in contradiction with so-called humanism, in the form in which we have been practicing it for several centuries, but I would say almost as its natural continuation, end quote. According to Levi-Strauss, the Enlightenment ambition of mastering nature, of setting humanity above nature, inevitably had destructive consequences for humanity itself. A humanity which could enslave nature was quite capable of enslaving fellow human beings. As David Goldberg has put it, quote, subjugation ... defines the order of the Enlightenment, subjugation of nature by human intellect, colonial control through physical and cultural domination, and economic superiority through mastery of the laws of the market, end quote. David Goldberg. Mastery of nature and the rational organization of society, which in the 19th century was seen as the basis for human emancipation, now came to be regarded as the source of human enslavement. The idea that technological and social progress could be the cause of barbarism has led many critics to find evidence not simply of humanism, but of the whole project of quote, modernity behind the Holocaust. Zygmunt Bauman has suggested that the final solution was the, quote, product, not, quote, failure of modernity, and that, quote, it was the rational world of modern civilization that made the Holocaust thinkable, end quote. Quote, the truth is that every ingredient of the Holocaust, all those many things that rendered the Holocaust possible, was normal, ... in the sense of being fully in keeping with everything we know about our civilization, its guiding spirits, its priorities, its imminent vision of the world, and of the proper ways to pursue human happiness together with a perfect society, end quote. Zygmunt Bauman. Modernity and the Holocaust. Wikipedia says Modernity and the Holocaust is a 1989 book by Zygmunt Bauman, published by Polity Press. As the title implies, it explores the relationship between modernity and the Holocaust. The book has been seen as a criticism of modernity, as one of Bauman's arguments is that it was modernity that led to the Holocaust, and that despite several decades passing, modernity has not yet come to terms with this tragedy. Back to the text. Bauman's hint that, quote, civilization, and quote, itself may have been responsible for the barbarism of the final solution is made explicit by Richard Rubinstein, who, in a phrase approvingly quoted by Bauman, argues that the Holocaust, quote, bears witness to the advance of civilization, end quote. Quote, the world of death camps and the society engenders reveals the progressively intensifying night side of Judeo-Christian civilization. Civilization means slavery, wars, exploitation, and death camps. It also means medical hygiene, elevated religious ideas, beautiful art, and exquisite music. It is an error to imagine that civilization and savage cruelties are antitheses. Both creation and destruction are inseparable parts of what we call civilization. End quote. Richard L. Rubinstein, The Cunning of History. I'm not finding a great introduction to this or a great description of this book. Anyway, moving on. Here again, in the debate on the origins of the Holocaust, as in the discussion about the other, we can see the conflation of arguments about post-Enlightenment discourse with those about a supposed tradition that has existed from the beginning of the Western or Judeo-Christian history. But what can it mean to suggest that barbarism is an inseparable part of civilization? It is, on the one hand, logically meaningless, since the two concepts are defined in opposition to each other. On the other hand, to suggest that, quote, the advance of civilization, end quote, inevitably leads to, quote, slavery, wars, exploitation, and death camps, end quote, can they mean that barbarism is an eradicable part of human nature? But is this not the posited concept of human nature that is as ahistoric as that supposedly held by humanists? Condemning civilization is forever imbricated with inhumanity is certainly an argument that sits uneasily with a critique of humanism, which claims that an ahistoric notion of, quote, man has been used to deny humanity to the West's others. The argument that humanism and rationalism, or, quote, modernity, are the causes of the Holocaust implies, in the words of Svetan Todorov, quote, not only that the speaker is disregarding or repressing the ideological origins of fascism in 19th century anti-humanism, but also that the speaker is willfully cultivating a logical paradox. He is complacently deducing the thesis of the inequality of man on the basis of human equality, end quote. I'm going to repeat that because it sounds apt to me. The argument that humanism and rationalism, or, quote, modernity, end quote, are the causes of the Holocaust implies, in the words of Svetan Todorov, quote, not only that the speaker is disregarding or repressing the ideological origins of fascism in 19th century anti-humanism, but also that the speaker is willfully cultivating a logical paradox, since he is complacently deducing the thesis of the inequality of man on the basis of human equality, end quote. And that's again from Svetan Todorov. Svetan Todorov lived from 1939 to 2017 and was a Bulgarian French historian, philosopher, structuralist, literary critic, sociologist, and essayist. He was the author of many books and essays which have had a significant influence in anthropology, sociology, semiotics, literary theory, intellectual history, and cultural theory. And that quote is from his book, Todorov on Human Diversity. The full title of this book is On Human Diversity, Nationalism, Racism, and Exoticism in French Thought. How can we think about peoples and cultures unlike our own? In the early modern period, the fact of human diversity presented Europeans with little cause for anxiety. They simply assumed the superiority of the West. During the 18th century, this view was gradually abandoned, as thinkers argued that other peoples possessed reason and sensibility, and thus deserved the same respect that Westerners accorded themselves. Since that time, however, Enlightenment belief in the universals of human nature has fallen into disrepute. Critics allege that such notions have had disastrous consequences in the 20th century, ranging from prejudice to persecution and outright genocide. Zvetan Todorov, an internationally admired scholar, aims in this book to salvage the good name of the Enlightenment so that its ideas can once again inspire humane thought and action. The question he poses is of urgent relevance to the conflicts of our age. How can we avoid the dangers of a perverted universalism and scientism, as well as the pitfalls of relativism? Since the French were the ideologues of universalism and played a preeminent role in the diffusion of Enlightenment ideas in Europe, Todorov focuses on the French intellectual tradition, analyzing writers ranging from Montaigne, de Tocqueville, Michelet, and Renan to Levi-Strauss. Todorov shows how theories of human diversity were developed in the 18th century and later systematically distorted. The virtues of Enlightenment thought became vices in the hands of 19th century thinkers, as a result of racism, nationalism, and the search for exoticism. Todorov calls for us to reject this legacy and to strive once again for an acceptance of human diversity through a, quote, critical humanism, end quote, prefigured in the writings of Rousseau and Montesquieu. This is a work of impressive erudition and insight, a masterly synthesis that can help us think incisively about the racial and ethnic tensions confronting the world today. Back to the text. We have seen in previous chapters how the discourse of race was a product of the degradation of Enlightenment humanism, universalism, and reason. Scientific racism, which was much propounded by Nazi theoreticians, was not the application of science and reason to the question of human difference, but the use of the discourse of science to give legitimacy to irrational, unscientific arguments. The, quote, final solution, end quote, was implicit in the racial policies pursued by the Nazis. To engage in mass extermination, it was necessary to believe that the objects of that policy were less than human. But to say that it was a rationally conceived plan is to elevate the prejudices of the Third Reich to the status of scientific knowledge, in other words, to accept as true the very claims of racial discourse. As Todorov has put it, to attribute such ideas to Enlightenment humanism, quote, is to take at face value what was only propaganda, an attempt, most often a clumsy one, to replaster the facade of a building constructed for quite a different purpose, end quote. As a side note, I think there's a very good piece on here called the Subhuman and the Superhuman by Joachim Brun, which talks about the way that the Jews, and part of the reason, and this is kind of like a common thing you'll hear people of that, like critical theorists of anti-Semitism, that like the Jews are not viewed as like animals. Like those, I feel like that's the kind of like the key, the cornerstone of like racism, is usually that like other races are like are uncivilized in some capacity. Whereas the Jews are almost viewed as like super civilized, and for that reason, like kind of like alien, inauthentic, abstract, all-powerful, evil. I feel like that's a very specific aspect of like anti-Semitic thought, is the notion of the Jew as not merely different, but diabolical. And also, there's the idea with Jews that they're not really like of any place, whereas like other races, like they are of a place. They might be in the wrong place, but there's a place where they belong. Whereas the Jews are like a non-place, that are like the corroders of every community that they're in. So that's just a counterpoint to this the notion of just like subhumanness of the Jews. That's a very important point. But I think the general thrust of what he's saying here is definitely the case. Moving on. The second motif in the Frankfurt School analysis of fascism, which came to dominate post-war thought, was the critique of mass society. The concept of mass society began to win acceptance among sociologists in the 1950s. Stuart Hughes has pointed out both the ambiguity and irrationality of the concept of mass society and the underlying disillusionment with the soullessness of modern capitalist society which it expressed. Quote, the ways in which it was used were imprecise, overlapping, and frequently contradictory. Sometimes its emphasis was on undifferentiated numbers, sometimes on mechanization, sometimes on bureaucratic predominance. Yet for all their fuzziness of language, the analysts of mass society agreed on a few defining characteristics. What they saw about them was a situation at once uniform and fluid, a state of social, quote, nakedness, unquote, in which the notion of community seemed to be slipping away, and the individual lacked a cushion of intermediate groups to protect him against direct and overwhelming pressures from the wielders of political and economic power. End quote. Stuart Hughes. And that's from a piece by Stuart Hughes called The Sea Change, in a book called Between Commitment and Disillusionment. Not really seeing a good description of this book. Anyway, back to the text. For the sociologists of the mass society, technological progress and mass democracy had combined to debase society, creating a mass of people with little intellectual depth, spiritual involvement, or cultural profundity. The creation of such a mass society had taken humanity to the abyss of barbarism. Behind the rise of Nazism lay the willingness of the unthinking masses to follow herd-like behind demagogic leaders such as Adolf Hitler. The idea was first expressed in the Frankfurt School's analysis of the, quote, authoritarian personality, end quote, a personality type characterized by extreme obedience and unquestioning respect for authority, and usually accompanied by rigidity, conventionality, prejudice, and intolerance of weakness or ambiguity. According to the authors of the authoritarian personality, the potential of fascism lay in the presence of such a personality type within the mass of the people. Given that democratic societies such as the USA were also mass societies, the sociologists of the Frankfurt School believed that the potential existed for the rise of fascism there too. The critique of Enlightenment rationality and the critique of mass society became fused into the, quote, totalitarian, end quote, theory of fascism, popularized by Hannah Arendt in her book The Origins of Totalitarianism. The theory suggested that fascism was a species of totalitarianism, similar to the Soviet Union, Communist China, or, a comparison that later totalitarian theorists would make, the Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. The components of a totalitarian state were a herd-like mass, a compelling totalizing ideology that subsumed all under its cold logic, and a machine-like society that effaced all individuality in the name of a higher rationality. For Arendt, totalitarianism represented the, quote, madness of the mob, end quote, the, quote, refuse of all classes, end quote, falling under the leadership of D-class intellectuals. The members of the mob sought to merge into something larger than themselves, to give up the mob's individualism to belong to the mass. The critique of totalitarianism and of totality was to become a defining feature of post-structuralist discourse. The irony in this is that the critique of totalitarianism is in substance a reworking of the 19th century critique of Enlightenment rationalism and of mass society pursued by philosophers such as Nietzsche and Heidegger, whose work, as we saw in Chapter 4, flowed from the hostility of the intelligentsia to equality and mass democracy. Arendt was a student of Heidegger's, and Arendt's theory of totalitarianism carries over the main themes of Heidegger's thought in its anti-mass character, its incipient anti-rationalism, in particular its hostility to the Enlightenment as the embodiment of truth. The idea of the authoritarian personality and of the masses of the, quote, as the, quote, refuse of all classes, unquote, clearly has close parallels with the themes of crowd psychology which we discussed in Chapter 4. Both are a cry against what Heidegger called the, quote, anonymity of the they, end quote. Quote, an endless etc. of indifference and always the sameness, ... The domination of the indifferent mass, ... That destroys all rank in every world-creating impulse of the spirit, end quote. Heidegger. Introduction to Metaphysics. Wikipedia says Introduction to Metaphysics is a revised and edited 1935 lecture course by Martin Heidegger, first published in 1953. The work is notable for a discussion of the pre-Socratics and for illustrating Heidegger's supposed, quote, Kara, end quote, or turn in thought beginning in the 1930s, as well as for its mention of the, quote, inner greatness, end quote, of Nazism. Heidegger suggested the work relates to the unwritten, quote, second half, end quote, of his 1927 magnum opus, Being and Time. Back to the text. The anti-humanist belief that the technical forms of modernity arising from the human mastery of nature underlay the implementation of the Holocaust is also taken from Heidegger. Just as a side note, this is an important thing. This was from the historiography, because of the systematicity and the of Auschwitz and the Nazi death camp system. One of the things that is lost in a lot of that emphasis is that large portion of the Holocaust was not done in this type of round everybody up, put them into camps and kill them. A lot of it was done when Nazis would just get a place and they just kill all the Jews in the area. Like an Einsatzgruppen, I think it's how you say it, like an Einsatzgruppen, like attack, where they just go into a place and just round up the Jews and just shoot them. It's a term you hear sometimes in the historiography called Holocaust by bullets. So this kind of idea that reduces the Holocaust to the death camp system, reduces it to Auschwitz, is problematic, and I think it kind of puts a thorn in the side of any kind of theory that tries to just attribute like mass society, or like the Enlightenment or like modernity to the Holocaust. Um, you know, that's an important consideration to take in mind. Anyway, compare, for instance, Heidegger's analysis of the barbarism of the 20th century with a sociological interpretation of the same. Quote, agriculture is now a mechanized food industry. In essence, agriculture is no different from the production of corpses in gas chambers and death camps, the embargoes and food reductions to starving countries, the making of hydrogen bombs, end quote. Heidegger, cited in Jean-Francois Lyotard, Heidegger and the Jews. Quote, there is more than a wholly fortuitous connection between the applied technology of the mass production line and its vision of universal material abundance, and the applied technology of the concentration camp with its vision of a profusion of death, end quote. Edmund Stillman and William Pfaff, The Politics of Hysteria. Jean-Francois Lyotard's Heidegger and the Jews. Looking for a description of it. Not really seeing any description of it. What else am I looking for? Politics of Hysteria. Not really finding a good description of that book either. Back to the text. I find it odious that scholars can in all seriousness equate mass extermination with the production of McDonald's hamburgers or of Ford escorts, or make a comparison between technology aimed at improving the material abundance of society and political decisions taken to annihilate whole peoples and destroy entire societies. But what is interesting is that the second quote from Edmund Stillman and William Pfaff comes from a liberal interpretation of the Holocaust, whereas the first quote from Heidegger himself comes from an apologia for his Nazi past. Heidegger had been an active member of the Nazi Party until 1943. After the war, Heidegger attempted to rehabilitate his reputation, and in the document Rectorial Address, Facts and Thoughts, Heidegger marshaled the arguments which he hoped would distance himself from the Third Reich. The key piece of evidence for the defense was the assertion that Nazism was simply another manifestation of the spirit of modernity. According to Heidegger, there existed a, quote, universal will to power within history, now understood to embrace the planet, end quote. Heidegger. And that, quote, everything stands in this historical reality, no matter whether it is called communism, fascism, or world democracy, end quote. Heidegger. Cited in Thomas Rockmore's On Heidegger's Nazism and Philosophy, published in 1994. The description of this book says that Martin Heidegger supported National Socialism has long been common knowledge, Yet the relation between Heidegger's philosophy and political commitments remains highly contentious and recently has erupted into a vociferous debate, boldly refuting arguments that the philosopher's political stance was accidental or adopted under coercion. Rockmore argues that Heidegger's philosophical thought and his Nazism are inseparably intertwined, that he turned to National Socialism on the basis of his philosophy, and that his later evolution is largely determined by his continuing concern with Nazism. After developing a framework that clearly outlines the interrelation of Nazism and Heidegger's philosophy, Rockmore analyzes the famous rectoral address the philosopher delivered in 1933 upon becoming the rector of the University of Freiburg. In that speech, Heidegger sought to ground politics in philosophy. Rockmore examines the inseparable relation of politics and philosophy and Heidegger's being in time, the recently published Contributions to Philosophy, written from 1936 to 1938, and the interpretation of Hölderlin, Nietzsche, and technology. In its conclusion, Tom Rockmore considers the ongoing discussion of Heidegger's thought and Nazism in France, combining extensive documentation of the Heidegger controversy with philosophical and historical analysis. The book raises profound questions about the social and political responsibility of philosophy. Back to the text. It is a telling measure of the degree of confusion in post-war theory that liberal and Nazi explanations of the Holocaust can barely be prized apart. As James Hartfield observes, quote, Heidegger's thought, having tried to articulate or spiritualize National Socialism, went on to a more remarkable achievement. Through Hannah Arendt and the totalitarian thesis, Heidegger's ideas shaped the interpretation and critique of fascism after its defeat, end quote. James Hartfield. Footnote. See James Hartfield, The Heidegger Affair. Unpublished paper. End footnote. Indeed, it did more than that. The anti-humanism of Heidegger and Heidegger's fellow thinkers became a central theme of post-structuralist and postmodernist discourse, of colonial discourse analysis, and of the theories of difference and cultural pluralism. As Hartfield remarks, quote, how perverse that the rejection of ... barbarism should preserve the very prejudices that gave rise to it, end quote. Underlying the commonality of themes in racial and post-structuralist theory is their attempt to come to terms with the same problem, the disjuncture between a belief in equality and progress and a society that can seem to deliver neither. Read the whole of the passage in which Sartre rails against the hypocrisy of Western humanism, and this becomes clear. Quote, liberty, equality, fraternity, love, honor, patriotism, and what have you. All this did not prevent us from making anti-racial speeches about dirty niggers, dirty Jews, and dirty Arabs. High-minded people, liberal or just soft-hearted, protest that they were shocked by such inconsistency. But they were either mistaken or dishonest. For with us there is nothing more consistent than a racist humanism, since the European has only been able to become a man through creating slaves and monsters. End quote. Sartre. Preface to Fanon. Wretched of the Earth. 19th century thinkers who held fast to Enlightenment principles, whether liberal or revolutionary, argued that the disjuncture could be closed by social transformation. By the end of the century, however, liberals had by and large come to despair of the possibility of any such transformation, and were drifting over to the long-held conservative belief that inequalities were both inevitable and necessary. By the midpoint of this century, the experience of Nazism and the defeat of working-class movements had led radicals to similar pessimistic conclusions. As Stuart Hughes observes in his wonderfully lucid study of post-war intellectual thought, There was within the radical intelligentsia a widespread, quote, disappointment in the course of recent history, in the strategy of the political parties that laid claim to the inheritance of Marx, and most particularly in the proletariat itself. The class which Engels had celebrated as the, quote, heirs of classical philosophy, end quote, had failed to perform in the style expected of it, end quote. Stuart Hughes. Post-war developments entrenched such views. The experience of the failure of the student revolts of May 1968, the collapse of both Stalinist and Social Democratic parties in the 80s, and the demise of Third World liberation movements all added to the belief that social transformation was a chimera. The very goals of, quote, modernity, end quote, seemed unattainable. Bauman has put it, quote, post-modernity is modernity coming to terms with modernity's own impossibility. A self-monitoring modernity, one that consciously discards what it once was once unconsciously doing, end quote. Footnote: Bauman, Modernity and Ambivalence, published in 1991. The description of this says, modern civilization, Bauman argues, promised to make our lives understandable and open to our control. This has not happened, and today we no longer believe it ever will. In this book, Bauman argues that our postmodern age is the time of reconciliation with ambivalence. We must learn how to live in an incurably ambiguous world. Bauman. Back to the text and footnote. For post-war theorists, the gap between belief and reality could be closed not by transforming the reality, but by relinquishing their beliefs. Despairing of social change, post-structuralist and postmodernist thinkers asserted instead that equality and humanity had no meaning, and that difference and diversity should be our goal. Despair about social transformation also led post-war theorists to see the barbarism of the 20th century not as a product of specific social relations, but unspecifically as the conquest of, quote, modernity, unquote. In Chapter 2, I suggested that the claim that the categories of modernity necessarily gave rise to a racial division of humanity conflates two different meanings of, quote, modernity, end quote. On the one hand, there is modernity in the sense of an intellectual or philosophical outlook, which holds that it is possible to apprehend the world through reason and science, which has come to be called the, quote, Enlightenment Project, end quote, and the technological advance that such an outlook has engendered. On the other hand, modernity has also come to mean that particular society in which these ideas found expression. In other words, capitalism. By conflating the social relations of capitalism with the intellectual and technical progress of, quote, modernity, end quote, the product of capitalism can be laid at the door of modernity. The specific problems created by capitalist social relations became dehistoricized. In post-structuralist discourse, racial theory, colonialism, or the Holocaust are not investigated in their specificity as products of distinctive tendencies within capitalist society, but are all lumped together as the general consequence of, quote, modernity, end quote. In this way, the positive aspects of capitalist society's invocation of reason, capitalist society's technological advancements, capitalist society's ideological commitment to equality and universalism, are denigrated, while its negative aspects, the inability to overcome social divisions, the propensity to treat large sections of humanity as, quote, inferior or, quote, subhuman, the contrast between technological advance and moral turpitude, the tendencies towards barbarism are seen as inevitable or natural. That's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening.